That's I Pity the Country by the legendary Willie Dunn. You're listening to Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Today, the story of a child's survival and the tenacity it took to prove what happened to her 50 years ago. Trina Roach is the investigative journalist who brought us Debbie Paul's story. She's a member of the Glooscap First Nation and an award-winning Mi'kmaq journalist who teaches journalism at the University of King's College in Halifax. Hello, Trina.
Hello, Rosanna.
Well, this is just an incredible story, and what a journey for both you and Debbie. When did you first know that her story needed to be told?
I was working with CBC. The Investigates team set up to look into residential schools. And I said, it's important to ask in the community, what research that people in the community want to have done. And I talked to someone who lives in Sipekne'katik. He's a neighbor of Debbie Paul. And the first thing he said was, you need to hear Debbie Paul's story. And so I had a long conversation with Debbie. We spoke for about an hour just over the phone. And as her story unfolded, and her memory is so strong, and I was taking notes, it was so compelling right off the bat. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is a story that needs to be told. She's ready to tell it. It hasn't been a story that she's repeated very often, but she's ready to tell it now. And she needs to tell it so she can get the compensation that she deserves.
And what struck you most about her story?
This is a story, that really took place 5 decades ago, but still it impacts how Debbie sees herself. It has shaped her. She still lives with that. It still impacts her today, and not just in terms of the compensation, but how she sees herself, how she still has to remind herself, that, I'm not that kid anymore, that I matter. And she said that again and again throughout the story in conversations I had with her off camera many times. And so I thought, this kind of trauma that Indigenous peoples experience, it doesn't go away. You don't just grow out of it. It sticks with you and shapes how you see yourself and how you think others see you for the rest of your life. So that's unique to Debbie, but I think it's probably something that a lot of people can relate to, especially survivors.
Absolutely. There's so many reflections and things that seemed familiar to me in watching that story and listening to Debbie's story from my own mother's, residential school past and so on. The story that you wrote online is aptly called Burden of Proof. The government claims it's willing to compensate 60 Scoop survivors, but the onus is on them to provide that paperwork, that proof from their childhoods. How difficult is that for survivors?
It's very challenging. You have, Debbie, who is not on Facebook, not someone who can do, extensive, deep research. I mean, she was trying. It's not like she just started when I got involved. But she felt that the challenge for her is, it's traumatic. It also requires research skills. And the papers she needed are in a different country. And I tell you, it's not just Debbie who wants records. That is a repeated theme that I've heard in conversations with other survivors. I just want the records. I just want access to the records. And some of those records are available either, through the federal government and Library and Archives Canada or the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. The records that they get, they're sort of, putting them online as they're able to. But you still have to be able to navigate through those sites. And it is a massive challenge, I think, when you're looking at a certain demographic that's aging, to be able to access that kind of information.
Mm-hmm. And you were able to track down those records from the school that Debbie attended in Rockland, Massachusetts, and you decided to travel down there with her. Why did you want to make that trip together?
I think for Debbie, she was keen to tell her story, but really she was nervous to go. And to know that she would be going with me and Jillian Taylor, a CBC producer who's also First Nations, and myself, who's Mi'kmaq, that was comforting to Debbie. So that she wasn't there by herself having these moments and maybe not even finding what she needed.
Right. And it's interesting to me that you pointed out that you as a Mi'kmaq person and Jillian Taylor as a First Nations person went with her. Do you feel that it made a difference that you were Indigenous and had the knowledge of that history?
I think it did. It made a difference for Debbie, and I know that because she just said it. Right. She said it. But she felt like she could trust us, that we got it. And I have that feeling too. Like, you know, I've spent my whole career, like I am Mi'kmaq, but I've also spent my whole career telling stories about Indigenous people, about Mi'kmaq people. And I think that being Mi'kmaq doesn't inherently give you some sort of ability to do sensitive storytelling. Mm-hmm. that is a skill you sort of gain over time in terms of understanding that, you know, I bear a responsibility to people in my story. And I always wonder if that's more than if I just worked in mainstream news and was covering, you know, City Hall and this and that. Like when you're going into Mi'kmaq communities and you're sort of stepping into people's lives, you know, there's a weight there and there's a responsibility, and you learn that if you're going to earn that trust, you have to keep that trust and maintain that trust. The relationship between you and the person you're doing a story on takes on a bit of a different feel.
Yeah. What are the moments you'll most remember from that experience?
I have to say there's two, and I think they stand out in the story. When she saw her school record, the emotion in Debbie, the sense of just knowing how important it was, even if she doesn't get the compensation, just the fact that it proved her story was true, that sense of validation, which was so important to Debbie. And Debbie said, you know, I matter. And that was incredible. But the phone call, the Skype call with Mary Rome, who's now Mary Shanklin, I mean, I was standing off camera crying.
Oh my gosh, I was weeping like a baby when I know. Oh gosh, so beautiful.
It was. I'll just never forget that. That.
Often people think that journalists have to be, you know, unbiased and maybe unfeeling at some point. But you're saying that you cried and you had all these emotional connections and feelings with her. How did it feel to hear these things click for her and hear her say, I matter. This is proof I'm not lying?
It was incredible for me. And I have to say, because now I'm teaching journalism and I've given lectures on this like myth of an unbiased journalist.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that exists. We all have a social location. We all have a point of view. Just as a journalist, the tools we employ to craft our stories make it fair and balanced and accurate, right? Accuracy is the key to what makes journalism.
Right.
And so, you know, if I'm feeling emotionally impacted by Debbie's story, that doesn't make it less accurate. In fact, I think that emotional accuracy is just as important in storytelling. And most times when I've talked to somebody who said, oh, I got taken out of context, you know, they're talking about another interview they did. Often they're referring to that emotional, because they might have said the words, the quote is accurate, but maybe it's the emotional context that they're talking about. So emotional accuracy is just as important. And to get that right, you have to really understand, to be empathetic and be connecting with the person you're doing a story on.
Yeah, I'm going to take your class at the University of King's College.
I would love to have you in my class.
Sitting in the back. Thank you so much for your time, Trina, and use your power for good.
Thank you, Willalin. Thank you, Rosanna.
Trina Roach is an investigative journalist from Glooscap First Nation. She spent months digging into Debbie Paul's story. We reached her in Uktubuktut, also known as Halifax. Still ahead on Unreserved. During Debbie's harrowing year in Massachusetts, there was one woman who she says showed her kindness and love.
This doll became a symbol, you know, it's a symbol of my journey, my life journey.
Yeah, and you can't have it back either.
After years apart, Debbie and Mrs. Rome are reunited. But first, here's Ansley Simpson with a beautiful song about transformation and tenacity. This is Quay, changing into Thunderbird.